let's get started. So in this session, we're going to find out what happens when a sociologist, an economist, and a lawyer sit down at the same table. I don't know. It could be exciting. So I'm Julia Lynch. I'm a professor in the political science department here at Penn, for those of you who don't know me. And I've taken over Roger's role as chair of this panel. So let me begin by introducing our panelists and our discussant for the day. Our first speaker will be Racel Salazar-Pareñas, who is a professor of sociology at the University of Southern California. And in keeping with our focus on interdisciplinarity and cross-disciplinarity in this program, it's worth noting that Professor Pareñas has taught previously in programs of American Studies, Asian American Studies, and Women's Studies. Her research concerns the feminization of labor and migration and globalization, with a focus on how processes of globalization simultaneously reinforce and challenge traditional gender norms. Her 2011 book with Stanford University Press, Illicit Flirtations, describes the experience of indentured mobility among Filipina hostesses. She's currently working on a cross-national research project that compares bonded servitude of migrant care workers in Denmark, the US, and the United Arab Emirates. Our second speaker will be Martin Roos, who is really exciting. He is a university lecturer in political economy at the Department for Continuing Education and a fellow of Kellogg College at Oxford University. He's also a senior research fellow at the Center on Migration Policy and Society, Compass, where he directs the Migration Observatory. Martin's research focuses on the economics and politics of international labor migration in comparative perspective. He has two recent books that sound really interesting. In 2013 from Princeton, there's The Price of Rights, Regulating International Labor Migration, and co-edited with Bridget Anderson in 2010, and then I gather reissued in 2012, Who Needs Migrant Workers? Labor Shortages, Immigration, and Public Policy. And finally, our discussant for today is Howard Chang, the Earl Hepburn Professor of Law here at Penn. He has written widely on immigration policy, international trade, and environmental protection. So I'm absolutely thrilled to have all three of these illustrious scholars with us today, and let's get started.
So I'll start. I'm going to time myself.
You'll time yourself, so I don't.
Well, you can time me too. Okay. Thanks for having me here. This might kind of echo, so I'm going to move it like that. Is that okay? I wrote the paper, but I didn't write the talk. You know, then that becomes really problematic, right? But I'm also a one-slide person, so this is a one-slide PowerPoint, which I'm going to show in the middle here. So let me start my timer. And so I'm going to talk about migrant domestic workers, and I look mostly at Filipino migrant domestic workers. I feel I'm saying something obvious here, but I need to set it up because I'm assuming some people might not know much about migrant domestic workers. So migrant domestic workers, they go everywhere, and so some of the dominant paths of migration that they take is like Mexican and Central American migrants come here to do domestic work. Indonesians go to richer Asian countries, and also in the Middle East. Sri Lankan women historically have gone to Greece and also the Middle East, but not so much the Middle East anymore. Polish and Ukrainian women are migrating to Germany. And other nations of Western Europe, and then Caribbean women have historically gone to the US and Canada to also do domestic work. And so, as I said, I focus on Filipinos, and they're kind of unique because their paths of migration like really take them all over the globe. So they are located in about 160 destinations throughout the world. And so as this workshop then is on citizenship, what I decided to do was revisit this old idea that I introduced in my book, Servants of Globalization, and that book came out a while ago in 2001. It was a comparative study of migrant Filipino domestics in LA and Rome. And in that study, I had introduced this concept that I called partial citizenship, which I referred to, the stunted incorporation of migrant domestic workers in host and home societies. And as partial citizens, basically, migrant domestics, they're not fully integrated in receiving nations, nor are they completely protected by sending nations. So in other words, they're denied full citizenship at both ends of the migration spectrum. So in this talk, I want to revisit this concept of partial citizenship. I actually don't like how I talked about it earlier because I felt first it was too amorphous, of a category, like it wasn't really clear, like what were really the determining factors that defined what is partial citizenship or the conditions of partial citizenship. And then also what I also didn't do well before was that I did not account for variations in destinations across like this global landscape, and that I had really focused on, Western destinations such as the US and Italy, where there is this strong sense of or recognition of individual human rights. So this concept then also apply to countries where human rights are not recognized as much, for instance, Singapore or the United Arab Emirates. So I should actually clarify that the study I'm doing, I changed it. It's now only looking at the UAE and Singapore, and I'm collaborating with the geographer Rachel Sylvie, and so we're looking at Filipino and Indonesian domestic workers in both these destinations. And so as I said, partial citizenship, is something I want to revisit, and I want to say that it's a shared status for domestic workers across the globe, and what I am noticing is that it's relevant in the lives of domestic workers in countries where their human rights are recognized, in countries where it's not. At the same time, their experience is not uniform, and their levels of exclusion. We could basically understand them through these scales or these gradations. And so in this talk, while I said, so in the paper I talked a little bit about partial citizenship vis-a-vis the Philippines. I'm not going to do that because of time constraints, but I'm going to just focus then on the conditions of partial citizenship for domestic workers in key destinations in the Filipino diaspora. So I'm pretty much just looking then at the destinations. And so this is my one slide wonder, so this is my slide. I think there's one slide, but I think there's a lot of information in there. And so then, so in revisiting partial citizenship, what I found was that there's basically like four central characteristics that we can say, like define what is partial citizenship. And first is that domestic workers with partial citizenship are likely to have limited freedom. Secondly, they're likely working in a place where domestic work is not recognized as labor. And third, they have limited integration in the state. And then lastly, they also are given minimal reproductive rights. So, but as I said, this comes in like different gradations, so that's what I want to talk about. But then what I also want to emphasize is that while there are these differences, what I want to point out, however, is that there is kind of this shared sort of experience that migrant domestic workers have cross-nationally. So let me just go over this then. So I'm talking about the limited freedom. I think that my charts are sometimes, I think it makes sense, but I think I jump around from column to column here. But I'm talking about the first two columns here. So what I want to point out is that for many domestic workers, they have mandatory live-in employment. And so when they go to a destination country, the visa that they're given basically requires them to live with their citizen sponsor. And in many countries, they have limited mobility to change their citizen sponsor. So just going over these countries then, what's interesting is that the country that does not, that really gives domestic workers more flexibility is Italy. it stands alone in doing that. And so when you're a domestic worker in Italy and you get your permesso di soggiorno, like you are not required to be a live-in domestic worker. You can actually only work, you can work for this sponsor for minimum hours. You don't have to work like 40 hours a week like is the case in most other destinations. So when I'm talking about domestic workers here, I'm not talking about undocumented migrant domestic workers, so I want to be clear about that. So I'm talking about like countries where there's actually visa programs that allow migrant domestic workers to come in. So the U.S. then might stand out for some people. For the U.S., what I'm talking about is the people with B1, A3, G5 visas. These are the domestic workers for diplomats, like expats, for UN workers. And so they can bring in their domestic workers, and those domestic workers then are bound to work for them, and those domestic workers do not have this flexibility to find another sponsor and work for another sponsor. And so what I want to pay attention to is this other clause, which is that they cannot change their employers. And so I want to clarify that, so in Singapore, so I want to talk about this a little bit. So in Singapore, yes, you can change your employers, but the problem is, in Singapore, when you first come in there, you don't get paid your first 6 months of work. Instead, you get about 50 Singaporean dollars a month. And this is because your salary goes to your agent, the broker who brought you there. So then, during that 6 months, you're really unable to really leave, right? So what if the 6 months passes? Can you leave? Yes, you can kind of leave more easily, but the problem is every time you change your job, you are charged by your broker 2 months of your salary. So then it basically puts these people in this condition of debt bondage, you can say, because then every time you change your job, it's like a 2-month penalty, wage penalty that you get. So then I say, yes, you can do it, but then I want to clarify, well, you can't really do it. So GCC countries, I know there's variations across GCC countries, but looking specifically at Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, they can change employers, but only with the employer's permission. And so will the employer then grant these domestic workers permission? They're unlikely to do so because then an employer, when they hire a domestic worker, they get a 2-year contract to get them in their homes, and they pay about $4,000 US to the broker to be able to get them to work there. So what if this domestic worker quits, right? That means that they lose that $4,000. So they're unlikely then to allow domestic workers to leave. So Hong Kong is interesting. Yes, they can leave, but the problem with Hong Kong is that there's this 2-week rule that binds domestic workers. So if you want to quit in Hong Kong, yes, you can, but then you only have 2 weeks to find a new employer. And if you don't find an employer within those 2 weeks, you basically get deported. Israel is another interesting case. So in Israel, they kind of see themselves as a country with that recognizes human rights. And so what they did was before 2009, if you were a domestic worker in Israel, you could change jobs. But then after 2009, they took away that right. And so what they, let me switch this around. Before 2009, you could not change employers. After 2009, they finally gave you the right to change employers. But the problem was they added this clause. They basically added the clause that you could only live there for 63 months. So after 63 months, you have to leave Israel. So then they say you have the option of staying in Israel if the sponsor that you had when that 63 months hits opts to keep you as their domestic worker. And so then the saying among Filipinos in Israel is that I can stay in Israel until my employer dies. So basically a lot of them then find themselves in the situation of servitude with these employers that they're bound to if they've been there for more than 63 months. So the last country I want to talk about is Canada here. So Canada is really interesting because you can change your citizen sponsors. So the deal in Canada, there's a live-in caregivers program so that if you work for a family for 2 consecutive years, after the 2 years, you can qualify for landed status. But let's say you work for someone for 9 months and then you quit. You can't it's not like you're adding X number of months again to this other family, you have to start over and do your 24 months again. So the incentive for you is not to quit, and you actually have a 4-year window to do this. So you're really kind of in this time clock. So like while they can quit, the point is they're unlikely to quit. And so besides, so we can see then that domestic workers have limited freedom. So another shared condition they have is that in a lot of countries, domestic work is not really considered as labor. This is despite kind of the passage of Convention 189, which is this, ILO convention to try to recognize domestic work. And so there's been some positive effects of, the 189 convention, one being in 2013, in January 2013, Singapore finally gave domestic workers the right to a day off. But in a lot of countries, they still don't have a right to a day off, Israel included, in Taiwan, and so GCC countries as well. And then in Taiwan, what's really interesting is that in 2009, they passed the labor standards law, but that they did not include domestic workers in that law. And a couple of weeks later, they passed this other law called the Domestic Workers Protection Act. And so that law basically says domestic workers have the right to a contract. So what it means basically is that they have the right to negotiate the working conditions when they first get there, but that there are no minimum standards that the employers have to basically abide by. And then you can see here variations in salary, with some really poorly paid, and that the cost of migration usually depends on the salaries that they receive. And so, like for instance, a domestic worker who wants to go to Taiwan will probably pay about $7,000 US, as opposed to going to GCC countries will only cost you about $500. And so then, additionally, I want to talk about the limited integration of domestic workers. And so hardly any countries really give them this option of transitioning to a green card or permanent residency, Italy, Canada being two of them. But in most other countries, they can stay there in perpetuity, but then they can't really change their status. And so then lastly, the minimal reproductive rights of domestic workers is another shared status that they have or condition that they have. And so in most of these countries, they cannot bring their kids with them. And so then, people say, well, it's the work conditions does not allow that. But then even if you're a live-out domestic worker, which is really rarely the case, but even if you start kind of becoming an independent worker, you cannot bring your kids over with you. And so then some states are even stricter. And so this is where you can see variations in human rights recognition. And so in Singapore, so when you look at people who get pregnant, domestic workers who get pregnant, so in Singapore and Israel, you basically are automatically deported when you get pregnant, versus in other countries like Hong Kong, you will get state benefits. Italy, you will get state benefits that they will take care of your kid until, or they'll give you prenatal care. And so then in GCC countries, it is likewise strict. So in GCC countries, if you are single and you get pregnant, you basically get deported as well. Or you get incarcerated first, and then you get deported. So now I want to talk about, what is the significance of, partial citizenship? And so the title of the talk is says race, gender, and partial citizenship. Race is a little bit obvious, yes, there's national exclusion, so they limit the integration of domestic workers, so I don't really want to get into that. I feel like that's a little bit too obvious. Another person who's sort of given us a theoretical lens to think about why a condition such as partial citizenship would emerge is Oscar Sasson in her discussion of the opposite terms of nationalism, in which talks about kind of the opening of borders for economic reasons, and labor leads to basically also the simultaneous renationalization of borders against people. And so then that's also one force that's leading to partial citizenship. But what I want to focus on is basically how is gender inequalities reflected in partial citizenship, and particularly the ideology of female domesticity, and how does that promote partial citizenship. And so while countries then, demand the domestic labor of migrant workers, what we are also seeing countries struggle with is they're struggling to accept the commodification and defamiliarization of childcare and housework. So basically we're seeing the struggle in the reduction of the legal status of migrant workers to the migrant domestic workers to that of a quasi-family member. And so the conditions of partial citizenship, basically, what it does is that it relegates the legal status of migrant domestic workers to nothing but a family member, and that it denies them the status of being an independent worker. And so this is illustrated in various conditions of partial citizenship that I spoke about, including, for example, their limited freedom, their limited reproductive rights, and then the limited terms of their membership. And so these limitations signal the incorporation of migrant domestic workers, not really as a worker, like I said, but as a member of the family, and that they're basically not an independent migrant, but they're a dependent subject. And so then what this signals to me then basically is that you see the daily politics of domestic work reflected then in their legal incorporation as domestic workers. And so a sociologist, Cameron McDonald, wrote a book about nannies and the relationship of nannies and employers and the relationship of nannies to these children. And she described the daily conditions of migrant domestic work as one of being shadow mothers. And so then I want to take that argument that Cameron McDonald makes in describing the daily lives of domestic workers to say that likewise we can say that the incorporation, the legal incorporation of domestic workers is as shadow mothers. And according to Cameron McDonald, shadow mothers basically, as shadow mothers, domestic workers, are usually expected to be this puppet of the working mother. And so their presence is considered nothing but this extension of the employer. As such, they're there to maintain kind of the traditional gender order in the family and ease the impacts of women's labor market participation in this order. And so the constitution of domestic workers as shadow mothers, one that's solidified in their conditional residency as family members upon migration, tell us that it's this culture of maternalism that haunts migrant domestic workers, as it creates this demand for their labor, but at the same time relegates their legal status to be an extension of the biological mother in the family, or you know, the mother in the family. So the idea that women should take care of their own children and their own parents and do their own cooking and cleaning regardless of their income contributions to the family is the manifestation of the non-recognition of domestic work as genuine labor by not just employers but also by the state. So this affects not only the women of the household but also the women they hire to perform domestic work. So consequently, society struggles to recognize the labor performed by paid domestic workers, resulting in limited labor rights, their limited labor rights and a murky legal status for the migrants who do this work. So the continued ideological stronghold of maternalism results in a paradoxical situation for migrant domestics. So states recognize the need for their labor but refuse to grant them independent legal status. And it effectively then transforms them into these like quasi-family members, like I said. And so basically this tells us that the state's immigration governance of migrant domestic workers as one of the family retains not just the familialization of care, but also the designation of this labor as unpaid work to women. So let me end there. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation, Julie and Rogers. It's a pleasure to be here. My talk aims to contribute to debates about immigration and the welfare state, and specifically to this long-standing question to what extent immigration challenges the inclusive welfare state. And I'm going to talk specifically about the free movement of workers within the European Union. Now, by coincidence, I flew in last night, and I woke up at 5 a.m. in the morning in a hotel, and as you do, I started surfing the web, and I found out today that today is actually Europe Day. I didn't know this until this morning. So today is Europe Day, so that's when the European Union celebrates the achievements of the EU and the 4 freedoms of the EU. The 4 freedoms being freedom of goods, capital, services, and labor. And under the free movement of workers within the EU, what that means is that any EU citizen, so by that I mean any citizen of an EU member state, has the right to freely move and take up employment in any other EU member state without any restrictions, and has the right to access that EU member state's welfare state without any restrictions, on the same basis as citizens. So EU free movement of workers combines open borders within the EU with full and equal access to the welfare state. And that combination is, of course, very much an exception in international comparison. And where, in most countries' policies, you've got a trade-off, a tension between admitting migrants and giving them access to the welfare state. And what I want to do in this talk briefly is to analyze the sustainability of the EU's policies. And the particular argument that I want to make is that in the context of free movement, where there's no restrictions on migration and where there's no restriction of the access to the welfare state, the nature of the labour market plays a critical role in driving the scale of migration to particular countries. Specifically, I want to argue that flexible labour markets tend to attract many more migrant workers than more regulated labour markets. And the nature of the welfare state, in particular the extent to which it allocates or involves non-contributory benefits, plays a critical role in determining the costs of immigration. And if you combine these two aspects, labour market flexibility and nature of the welfare state, I think you can understand the pressure that free movement in the EU has recently come under political pressure. And Britain, in particular, has been at the forefront of calling for reforms of free movement. And what I would like to argue that Britain's problem with free movement does derive, in part, from its relatively unique position within the EU member states of combining flexible labour markets, which means there's a lot of immigration, with a relatively non-contributory welfare state. And in the end, I'll briefly discuss whether detention can be overcome, which of course is inherently a normative question. So briefly, just on the tension between immigration or open immigration and the welfare states, I'll briefly talk about the US and then in general, at least in my understanding, the debate both analytically and in terms of policy maybe has not been settled here, but I mean for a long time this has been discussed. There's a well-known speech, Milton Friedman, very well-known paper by Gary Freeman, a political scientist, basically both saying that immigration, especially lower-wage immigration, can create fiscal costs, therefore there's inherent tension between open immigration flows and equal access to the welfare state. And of course this tension was reflected in the end in policy. As you will all know, in the early 1990s, President Clinton instituted the Carter Commission, the Jordan Commission, to review immigration policy in light of concerns about the fiscal effects of immigration in this country. And the Jordan Commission recommended that the US reduce its legal admission of migrant workers, but maintain access for migrants to the welfare state. And Congress turned around and did exactly the opposite. It maintained relatively open access to migrant workers, but it cut back on access to welfare benefits. So now there's a big difference between the welfare benefits for non-immigrants, as you call them here, temporary migrants, and permanent migrants. And Ditchner in his book described this as a triumph for free market expansionists, basically accepting the trade-off between openness and rights. Now, in the book, The Price of Rights, that was mentioned, I basically tried to generalize this tension between immigration and welfare state to saying, well, in theory, there can be a tension between all rights. If rights create costs for the receiving country or perceive to create costs, the extent to which countries are open to admitting migrant workers will depend on the extent to which these costly rights can be restricted. So what I did in the book was analyze 104 labour immigration policies in 46 countries, and I measured two things: the extent to which they're open to admitting migrant workers, and openness, and the rights they grant migrant workers after admission. And there's various different aspects that I analyzed, but I was in particular interested if there's a tension. Is there a tension between openness and rights? And I won't spend much time, but I mean, there's kind of statistical analysis and more qualitative analysis in the book, but basically the only statistically significant correlations that emerge are all negative. So these are correlations between openness of labor migration programs that target low-skilled, medium-skilled, high-skilled and very high-skilled workers and the types of rights that they grant migrants. So the countries that are more open to admitting migrant workers tend to be more restrictive in terms of rights. And it's important to point out that actually it's just a few rights that are involved in this trade-off, namely the rights that create net costs for receiving countries. So I think in general, in policy practice, and both analytically, I think we would expect there to be a tension. Now, just for clarification, this was a couple of weeks in The Economist and wrote a story about this work, and this chart made the rounds. And so this is not what I'm arguing, but they included this chart anyway because it looked nice. So this is my diagram of rights restrictions around the world, and this chart suggests that there's a trade-off between the stock of all migrants in a country and the rights. What I'm arguing is, I'm talking specifically about labor immigration policy admissions. My argument doesn't necessarily translate to families, students and other migrants. But anyway, this suggests that the countries with the highest stock, the Gulf states, have the fewest rights, and so on. But my argument is mainly about admissions policy. So, from some people who have taken issue with some of the findings of the book have pointed out to me, well, the EU is different. And my analysis in the book, for EU countries, I only look at policies toward non-EU member states. Okay, so I've not talked about free movement in the book. So I'm using this chapter as an opportunity to think a little bit more about free movement and the EU. So as I explained, in the EU, you have the right to freely move and take up employment, and you have full access to the welfare state. Now, this right doesn't apply to everybody. You've got to be a job seeker. If you're non-active, so if you're retired or if you're a student, you have to have health insurance, and you have to show that you're not a burden on the state in order to move to another country on a long-term basis. But if you're a job seeker, if you're working, those conditions don't have to be met. Now, in a new country, this is just briefly, many people know this, the EU enlarged in 2004, 8 new member states in Eastern Europe, and again in 2007, Romania and Bulgaria. All these countries have significantly lower GDP per capita than the existing EU 15 member states. Now, because there were lots of fears about mass immigration from these countries in the existing member states, the European Union allowed the existing member states to temporarily restrict the employment of workers from those new states. Okay? And this just shows you, the rule was you can restrict for 7 years. You can restrict employment, but not the immigration. So you can't prevent anybody moving, but you can prevent people from accessing the labour market. And this just shows you when countries lifted these restrictions on different workers. And for the purpose of this talk, I just want to point out that in 2004, when these 8 East European countries joined it, Ireland, Sweden and the UK were the only 3 countries that lifted restrictions immediately. Okay? All other countries maintained restrictions. But on 1st of May 2004, if you're a Polish worker, you could freely go to Ireland, Spain and the UK and take up employment. So it's a bit difficult to analyze what determines migration to different EU countries because they lifted these restrictions at different periods of time. You can also have a debate about the effectiveness of these restrictions because you can't prevent people moving. In theory, you can prevent them from working, but enforcement obviously is very difficult. So what happened after 2008? Well, big increase in A8 migration, obviously, but very differentiated across different countries. Britain had a 10-fold increase in the number of, at the bottom, in the number of A8 workers, so A8, the East European countries, to just under 500,000. Germany has the largest number, but the increase, so it used to have the largest number in 2004, but the increase was much smaller. Ireland, Eurostat doesn't have data for 2004, had a huge increase. Ireland had very few workers, but then a big increase. So the increases have been quite differentiated, but Britain really has seen very substantive inflows. This is just a stock of A8 migrants employed in the UK. And what's interesting here is during the economic downturn, people argue migrants will go home. Well, not really in Britain. They employment stabilized of A8 workers and has been increasing ever since. So, briefly, the changing politics of free movement. Until 2004, countries were relatively similar in their economic development, with the exception of maybe Portugal, Spain, and Greece. But actually, free movement was not very contested, and there wasn't very much of it. Since 2004, and especially after the economic downturn and before the lifting of the restrictions on Romanian Bulgarians, there's a big debate about free movement. And the debate now is precisely about the tension between free movement of workers and free access to the welfare state. Britain in particular, this is David Cameron writing in the Financial Times, says that we must do two things. A, we must think about restricting movement itself, and we must think about restricting EU nationals' access to the welfare state. Other countries, including Denmark, Austria, my own country, the Netherlands, have not said that they want to restrict free movement. Actually, they've specifically said they want to protect free movement, but they want to restrict access to the welfare state. The Dutch Foreign Minister, again, restrict access to the welfare state. Polish Foreign Minister, interestingly, but maybe not surprisingly, the Poland, major standing country, says they will not allow any restrictions, they will veto any restrictions on movement, but then they're less worried about access to the welfare state. Now, I say not surprisingly, because from the standing country's point of view, equality of rights is no good if your workers can't actually access these labour markets. So freedom of movement is more important than full equal access to the welfare state. So the Polish minister says, well, if some of these EU member states like Britain want to fix their welfare states, that's fine, but we have to protect free movement. The European Commission so far says free movement is fundamental, cannot be changed, cannot be touched. So we must continue with open borders and full and equal access. Now I just want to briefly, in the remainder of my talk, explain why I think that policy position is problematic. The EU Commission's policy position is problematic. Now, as I said, in the context of free movement, the flexibility of the labour market affects the scale of immigration, and the nature of the welfare state affects the fiscal cost of immigration. And different EU member states have very different labour markets and very different welfare states. Now, this just, sorry, I'll talk about the labour market flexibility first. Compare Sweden on the one hand and Ireland and the UK on the other hand. All of these three countries opened up to East Europe in 2004. Ireland and the UK have seen huge inflows. Sweden, hardly any aid workers have gone to Sweden, even though they had open borders. Even after controlling for population size and all these things, Sweden had a very limited inflow. And I think one of the primary explanations for that lies precisely with Sweden's labour market regulations. Heavily regulated labour market in Sweden, employers are required to employ migrants at the collectively agreed wages and equal conditions. So in Sweden, in theory, employers cannot use immigration to lower wages. There's nothing in Britain that stops an employer from lowering wages through immigration, as long as you still pay above the minimum legal wage. So the flexible labour market of Ireland and Britain attracted many, many more workers than the Swedish labour market. So that's why the Swedish model is so difficult to transfer to other countries, even though the Swedish immigration minister keeps telling other EU countries, adopt our model, open borders, or a very open admissions policy, but without saying that other countries don't have their heavy labour market regulation, which in practice, the heavy labour market regulation, the insistence on equal of rights, in practice acts as a restriction on immigration in Sweden. And this is not the case in other countries. Welfare states obviously differ across different EU member states, not only in terms of their size, so the share of social spending in GDP, but also in terms of their composition, in terms of contribution versus non-contributory benefits. So I've taken here, so I'm not an expert in this is just I'm using this paper to learn more about comparative welfare state analysis. I've taken OECD data, and what this shows you is, what this allows you to do is, it basically calculates the taxes and benefits that different people pay depending on where they are on the income distribution. So for the blue bars tell you, these are people who earn 25% of the average wage in these different OECD countries. And it tells you how much do they pay in taxes and benefits. And I've calculated, this is taxes minus benefits divided by average wage in that country, so you can make it comparable. So what this tells you is that the blue bars are all mostly negative. That tells you that somebody earning 25% of the average wage has a negative net fiscal impact. Okay, well this doesn't take account of his direct taxes and expenditure on public services. Okay? But the point I'm trying to make is that because of differences in taxation system and welfare states, the direction of the impact varies across countries. So in Ireland, if you 25% of your average wage, you make a contribution, even at that wage. In Britain, you make quite a big, you have quite a big negative impact. So the direction differs and the scale of it as well. So the point I'm trying to make is differences in welfare states have implications for the fiscal costs of low-skilled immigration in particular. Most inter-European migration from Eastern Europe, Eastern Europeans tend to be very skilled, young, and predominantly work in low-skilled jobs. So they tend to be overqualified for the jobs they do, so they work in low-wage jobs. So if you combine these, I'm just going to a couple of more slides and then I'll finish. So this chart basically just shows you, I've looked at two indicators, both taken from the OECD. One is the flexibility of labor markets. That's on the y-axis, the employment protection indicator. And the second one is maybe, and we can have a discussion about the appropriateness of this indicator. I try to come up with a measure of how contributory welfare states are. So to what extent are benefits based on prior contributions? And what I've done is I've looked at the share of social spending that is paid for through social contributions. So if you take all social contributions by workers and employers, what share is that of total social spending? Okay? As a measure of how contributory the welfare state is. So how much of the benefits are paid out through contributions. And I think this neatly identifies the British problem, as I said. And the British problem is that with free movement, where there's no migration restrictions, no full equal treatment, that you've got the most flexible labour market, at least according to these data, within the EU member states, and one of the least contributory welfare states. Now, some of you might be able to tell me what's going on with Denmark. I don't know why that is so low. Maybe I think Denmark has universal benefits where benefits are primarily paid through income taxation rather than social contributions. But Britain has a flexible labour market, attracts lots of migrants from East European countries, and has a relatively non-contributory welfare state, which makes it more costly in terms of fiscal impacts than other countries. So I'm not trying to explain the British position and say this necessarily accounts for the British position, but I'm just saying if you look at it very crudely from a kind of functionalist perspective, which is very old-fashioned, but I think there's something to be said about accounting for these differences in welfare states and labour markets. So there is this tension between unrestricted immigration and equal access to the welfare state. I think it's now at the heart of the debate in Europe about the future of free movement. And Britain, as I said, has this particular combination of flexible labour markets and a non-contributory welfare state. And so what should be done about it? And obviously this is a normative question. So I think there's four policy responses to Britain's situation, I think, that have been suggested. The first one is restrict EU immigration. So that's what David Cameron actually says. Let's restrict free movement. The second one is restrict EU migrants' access to the welfare state. Cameron also once said, and many other EU member states want that as well. Or, of course, you can make Britain's welfare state more contributory, which reduces the fiscal costs, or you can make the labour market less flexible, which reduces the scale of immigration. Now, Britain has suggested the first two options. European Commission, unsurprisingly, has suggested options 3 and 4. Now, why is that? And that's the main point I want to end on. I mean, normatively, where you come down on this, of course, critically depends on whose interests you have in mind. So, the spirit of free movement, of course, is that it's supposed to be in the best interest of the EU as a whole, not in the best interest of every single member state. So the EU says, well, you, Britain, if you complain about free movement, it's not immigration isn't the problem, your labour market is the problem, or your welfare state is the problem, fix your welfare state. And Britain says, well, if you think about it in terms of national interest, why should we change our labour market just to accommodate immigration? So I think the normative starting points have a key influence over what policy choice, in a way, you would recommend. And so my own normative position, which mirrors the one I've taken in the book, The Price of Rights, is that I think this open. I think to be sustainable, the European Commission needs to take more, not less, account, I think, of the national interests of member states. And I think that with the inclusion of 9 low-income East European countries, member states, I think it is very difficult to maintain this exceptionalism of both open borders and equal access. And in my own view, the selective restriction to certain welfare benefits, especially non-contributory benefits, is worth the price paying to maintain free movement. So I think free movement of workers is incredibly beneficial for migrants themselves and for the sending countries. There are also some benefits for receiving countries. But in order to protect that free movement, I would say it will be necessary to have a debate about restricting some of the access to the welfare state. And I will just, of course, there's another policy position which is taken by the UKIP Independence Party, which is to say, well, let's get out of the EU. And I thought I'd just finish with these election posters, which have caused quite a furore, as you can imagine, in the British press. We've got a European election May 22, and so these are the arguments that the UKIP Independence Party. There's a lot of discussion about this, but this guy apparently, this EU-posted work, ended up. This guy is an Irish migrant, an Irish actor. Anyway, I'll finish that. Thank you.
Well, both of these papers underscore the rather diverse approaches that receiving countries take toward the treatment of migrant workers. Professor Roos finds that most labor immigration programs in high-income countries are temporary migration programs, and that these receiving countries commonly will restrict the rights of migrants. He also notes that receiving countries face this trade-off between liberal admissions policies and liberal social rights after admission. A broader set of rights for migrant workers, including access to the welfare state, will increase the cost that they impose on the receiving country and reduce the incentives that the country has to admit those workers in the first place. From the perspective of the economic interests of the natives in the receiving country, these guest worker programs may be the optimal response to concerns regarding the impact of relatively unskilled foreign workers on the public treasury. Through these programs, the natives get to enjoy the benefits of those workers in the labor market, but they don't bear the fiscal burden of providing the full set of public benefits that those workers would receive if they had ready access to those welfare programs and to permanent residence and perhaps citizenship. The most skilled workers are the most likely to be paid well, the most likely to contribute to the public treasury by paying income and other taxes, and unlikely to make claims on means-tested entitlement programs. So because their immigration is especially likely to generate a net fiscal benefit and to promote the economic welfare of the incumbent residents, the international competition for those workers is intense, and countries of immigration respond with liberal admissions policies and a broad set of social rights. Less skilled migrants, however, are both less scarce and more likely to impose a net fiscal burden. So the trade-off between liberal admissions and liberal social rights applies the most severe limits on the rights of those workers. And as Professor Pereñas describes in the case of migrant domestic workers, the rights granted by the receiving countries are often quite limited and fall far short of full membership in the host society. Professor Roos focuses on an important exception to that general restrictionist pattern, the right of free movement of EU workers within the EU includes not only free access to labor markets, but also social rights generally equal to those enjoyed by nationals. And a right of free movement that includes this national treatment obligation entails a fiscal burden for countries that have the most progressive redistributive policies and that receive the largest numbers of less skilled workers. So it may not be surprising that it's the United Kingdom, which Professor Roos finds has both a relatively progressive welfare state and a relatively flexible labor market that attracts relatively large numbers of workers, from the new EU member states with lower per capita incomes. It's not surprising that it's the UK that has been the first EU member not only to impose restrictions on access to its welfare state for EU migrant workers, but also to suggest restrictions on access to labor markets for EU migrants. The European Commission, however, has so far opposed any of those changes to the EU rules on free movement. Instead, the Commission has urged that EU members either change their welfare policies for all of their residents or regulate their labor markets so as to attract fewer immigrants. And this debate raises the normative question, which is which of these various policy responses is the best response to the fiscal problem. Professor Roos suggests that the normative basis for this EU regime of free movement is the best interests of the EU as a whole, rather than the national interests of individual EU members. I wonder, however, whether equal access to the welfare state is really in the interests of the EU as a whole, as the European Commission seems to assume. If EU members respond to the free movement of workers by adopting less progressive welfare policies, then have we really promoted the interests that equal access supposedly serves? Is it really in the interests of the EU as a whole to encourage a general race to the bottom in welfare policies? Or if EU members respond with regulations that produce more rigid labor markets, like those in Sweden, that act as de facto restrictions on immigration of workers, then have we really promoted the interests that the free movement of workers supposedly serves? Or, as these posters suggest, if you cause wealthy states to leave the European Union, have you served the interests of the EU as a whole? The status quo in the European Union punishes EU members with more progressive fiscal policies and more open labor markets. If the ultimate result is to promote overall economic inequality, both by encouraging more regressive fiscal policies within each EU member, and by preventing the movement of workers from poorer members of the European Union to labor markets that pay higher wages. Or if the result is to undermine economic efficiency by encouraging more restrictive labor market regulations, then the regulations are inhibiting the hiring of relatively unskilled immigrant workers, and the unilateral policy responses suggested by the European Commission may not even serve the interests of those workers, let alone the interests of the EU as a whole. So I would suggest the stance of the European Commission may prove to be myopic, even in terms of its own policy objectives. So I'm inclined to agree with Professor Roos and with those EU members like Germany, Austria, and Denmark that from a normative perspective, the optimal response of the EU should be to give priority to labor market access and to allow some restrictions on immigrant access to the welfare state. After all, to the extent that the fiscal burden imposed by the immigration of relatively unskilled workers deters the admission of those workers, then we get the perverse result that our commitment to treat these workers as equals once admitted cuts against their admission and thereby makes them worse off than they would be if we instead relaxed that commitment. The EU, for example, could allow member states to restrict access to means-tested public benefits for a limited period of time to be specified by the EU. By allowing EU members to delay immigrant access to the full set of public benefits provided to their own citizens, we allow them to improve the fiscal impact of each relatively unskilled immigrant. And the longer the delay, the greater the improvement in the immigrant's total fiscal impact. The EU could also offer subsidies to offer some compensation to those EU members that bear a net fiscal burden because they receive a larger number of lower-income immigrants from other EU members. Policies that ease the fiscal burden that immigrant workers impose on the welfare state may mitigate political pressures to restrict the free movement of workers within the EU, and may also reduce the resistance to further EU expansion in the future to include more states with lower incomes, or may reduce the resistance in wealthy countries to progressive fiscal policies or to joining the European Union in the first place. Professor Roos also notes that outside the context of the EU and labor migration within the EU, rights other than access to the welfare state, including the right to residency and to family reunification, may also reflect the general trade-off between open admissions policies and social rights. The paper presented by Professor Pereñas explores the partial citizenship granted migrant domestic workers, whose social rights are generally quite limited. Receiving countries raise barriers to permanent residency for these workers, bind each worker to work for the sponsoring employer, deny them various labor rights, keep family members from joining the worker in the receiving country, and some receiving countries also deport migrant domestic workers that become pregnant. Again, although we may favor broad social rights for migrant workers in the name of equality and liberal principles of justice, we must also be mindful of the trade-off between liberal admissions policies and liberal rights after admission. So the question I would pose for research here is what social rights are feasible, subject to the constraint that we do not undermine the incentives for receiving countries to admit these workers in the first place? The answer to that empirical question may depend on the specific rights at stake, the receiving country, and the type or nationality of the workers whose rights are at issue. As Professor Pereñas notes, the exclusion of migrant domestic workers from the social rights granted citizens to some degree reflects racism and xenophobia. And those same impulses also make many countries reluctant to admit workers, even when their admission may serve the national economic interest of those receiving countries. And so racism and xenophobia make the trade-off between admission and social rights even worse than they would otherwise be. So while the EU embraces free movement for European workers within the EU, the EU members apply far more restrictive policies for workers from elsewhere. This trade-off raises the question, if we would like to improve the welfare of these migrant workers, then what should our priorities for reform be with all of these considerations in mind? One priority might be the freedom to leave an employer and take employment elsewhere without fear of deportation. That freedom would give guest workers greater power to assert their rights against abusive employers and thereby prevent those abuses without destroying the gains that the receiving countries enjoy in the labor market from employing those workers. This mobility among employers would improve the bargaining position of workers and thus improve their wages and working conditions. And proposals along these lines have made some limited progress in the United States, for example, where the Senate passed a comprehensive immigration reform bill last June. That bill would, among many other things, create a new non-immigrant visa program for less skilled workers. These W visas would allow workers to enter for a 3-year period, would be renewable, and would be portable. That is, these visas would allow workers within each category to leave one employer to work for another employer registered with a program. Unlike past programs for guest workers, including the infamous Bracero program, which tied each guest worker to a specific sponsoring employer. Well, if receiving countries resist granting broader rights to migrant workers, then what can sending countries do to induce receiving countries to adopt more liberal policies? Professor Pereñas has, in her paper, noted the example of the Philippines successfully demanding a higher minimum wage for domestic workers sent to Saudi Arabia. You might have bargaining by the sending state, although the government of the sending state may have limited power to bargain on behalf of its nationals if it lacks a credible threat. If the receiving state can turn to other sending states that can supply the relevant workers, then it may have little incentive to make concessions to the sending state. This observation suggests that the relevant sending states should form coalitions and negotiate as a bloc in order to maximize their market power and their bargaining power. As Professor Roos reminds us, however, demands for broader social rights must take into account the risk that by making migrant workers more costly, reforms may cause the government of the receiving state or employers in that state to respond by admitting or hiring fewer migrant workers. And liberals seeking the broadest social rights possible for migrant workers have to operate within the constraints imposed by the considerations of political feasibility and by the demand for labor in the receiving country. And in a second-best world, I suspect that the result of these efforts is bound to be a compromise that will fall short of the ideal from a liberal perspective.
Would you two like to respond to the discussant's comments, or should we?
Maybe just briefly, thank you very much. But in terms of the interest of the EU as a whole, I actually personally agree with you when I said that the EU has been insisting on both open borders and equal access to the welfare state. It is probably an argument that's based on principle rather than on a kind of comprehensive calculations of costs and benefits. What I've presented in a way suggests that the countries and the European Commission kind of are engaged in this debate about costs and benefits, which of course in practice may not be the case. Part of what I'm saying is just an appeal to take more account of interests and to maybe think at the EU Commission level, is this insistence based on principle really in the interest of what we're trying to do here. Yeah, so I would agree with that.
So thank you for your comments. I want to focus on one of the comments that you made at the end, which is this question of when we extend social rights of migrants, does that then, what is the cost then for the receiving state, and can they afford that to integrate all these migrant workers that they rely on economically? And so I think the case of, so one thing I do want to say is that, there is this notion that if you just open up the borders, all these migrants will run in here and they're just desperate to get in here, And so the case of Italy, complicates that assumption, because Italy, like I said, has the most, you could say, progressive and inclusive migration policy. So domestic workers, basically, even if they get amnesties there every 6 years, and so it's very easy then to get your legal status. Historically, it's been really easy to get your legal status as a domestic worker, and so then since they joined the EU, they've basically implemented more progressive policies, allowing for immediate family reunification for the children below 18 years old and the spouses of domestic workers. Additionally, after 5 years of continuous contribution to the social security program, you can get a green card and get permanent residency. But what's interesting is that despite that, the children are not coming and the men are not coming. And so they're not clamoring in there to take advantage of all these, benefits that they can get in this pretty progressive state in terms of their social welfare benefits. And so there's all these other factors that, besides economics, then that I think can shape people's sense of their life course plans. And so, one thing is that the language barriers, right? Another thing is that the second thing is that a lot of migrants don't really, because of the temporary migration flow, a lot of them actually never really have this intent to migrate there permanently, even if they stay there for a long time. And so the case of Italy, for example, majority of the husbands don't follow the wives, like a significant number do, but definitely not the majority of them. And then also what's really interesting is that the kids, while you do see an increasing number of children in schools there, there is sort of these three, it's like kind of three groups of children you find there. The children who were born there and raised there since they were infants, and it's like a very small group, because most of these children are still being sent back to the Philippines as infants, and they call them packaged children. So then the second group basically are those children that they bring in when they're 13. And so they bring them in there so that they can acquire the language, learn Italian, and then get into these front stage jobs, like, working as a retail clerk. But then the majority of kids, I realized, were coming in when they were like 17. And so when they come in at 17, they're basically getting prepped to enter domestic work. So you have the cycle of domestic, second like kind of generation or third generation of domestic workers coming in when they're 17. And as their parents retire or their mother retires, then they take over being the breadwinner of the family. And so for me, what's really interesting is this question then of, like Italy, for example, because of its progressive laws, you really don't see these migrants clamoring in there. But instead, what it has allowed is it's allowed them to have this like steady flow of cheap migrant workers they can rely on. But then in other destinations of migrant domestic workers, we don't really see what, except for Canada, if a similar thing would happen, because in all these other destinations, they're really exclusionary.
Great, it's your turn. Anja, we'll start with you, then Rick, then John.
I have a question from my question. Thank you for that. That was very interesting. I thought it's an interesting topic because social policy generally is still very much about national policy and review, and this idea of free movement is actually a very good intersection where you can see where review could have influence on social policy because it's a new policy and it has an effect on social policy. So that was really interesting. I was wondering if you could comment on what you think, not just normatively, but what you think the actual influence of the Commission has on national social policies, especially I know in Germany there was just a court case, or there was a comment, a series of court cases on exactly this issue, if benefits for EU citizens in Germany should be, if they should have access to unemployment benefits when they come to the country even though they haven't worked and contributed, since Germany as a welfare state where you contribute to a social insurance scheme, but they haven't contributed and haven't actually worked and paid into the social insurance. So I know that the comment by the Commission was that it's against EU law to deny citizens who come to Germany unemployment benefits, even though it's something that's inherent in the German welfare state. So I was wondering if you could comment on maybe if you know something about that case in Germany, or what you think the actual influence of the Commission is to amending statements like that, with more of just another noise.
Let's take a few, all right? Rick.
Another terrific panel that Microsoft is also writing this I just wondered in that the one terrific slide, if there were other columns that you could add about the work conditions of the domestic places like working hour regulation and rates, other kinds of things, and whether it broke the same way as the other patterns, or did it mitigate it in any way?
Okay.
And then secondly, building on the discussions, I remember during a paper by Victoria had in middle school talking about different ways that consular offices here in the United States representing legal migrant workers, more than legal migrant workers, how they would collaborate to try to somehow promote the rights of immigrant, often domestic workers, not just domestic workers, in different cities. And I just wondered if the Philippine government, given that that's a big office, is trying to promote the rights of Filipino workers in different countries. Are they collaborating with the consular offices of maybe other migrant workers in these different countries? And is that promoting movement towards better protections?
Okay.
Jonathan?
Thanks, and it's incredibly interesting, this whole thing. My question is to Martin, actually. I'm just thinking about this price of right thing, and the way in which you frame it in terms of the kind of welfare state costs and then welfare state costs of migration and the openness of the labour market. When I look at the British case, actually, I just wonder whether your interpretation isn't over-rationalising what seems to me in many ways a really knee-jerk response to disruption. I mean, the scale of migration after 2004 is just much bigger than we expected, and it's come at a time when the reasons which apparently, according to all the analysis I've seen, migration doesn't seem to be the reason why real wages have been stagnating in Britain since around 2001, way before accession, certainly before the financial crisis. So, I mean, the way I think a lot of the reason why there's been so much migration is to do with this particular institutional setup, but the political response to me seems to be much more visceral. And for a start, unemployment in Britain is really very low, even in the wake of the financial crisis. Actual, involuntary unemployment has remained surprisingly low, much lower than everybody expected to be. And the other thing is, it doesn't seem to be that the migration has necessarily displaced British workers all that much. Again, the evidence on this, there doesn't seem to, I see no kind of killer evidence that there really has been any obvious negative impact. So I'm just wondering how you read that. I mean, I think the great story is not only that this guy is Irish, but also that Nigel Farage's wife is herself a German migrant, which he hired. Therefore, he's the leader of the UK. Actually hired his German wife as an assistant. Therefore, demonstrating the usefulness of the labour markets and free movement. So, I just wonder if you could comment on that.
I'm going to exercise the chair's prerogative to add a question for Russell to that group, and we'll let you guys answer. I was curious in terms of the sort of larger story that you're telling about why domestic workers' rights are limited, sort of being related to the limited willingness of states to recognize caring work as work. I wonder if you could say a little bit about what happens in a country like Denmark, where caring labor by all women is more recognized by the state as labor than it is even in a country like Italy. So in places where childcare and social services for the elderly are sort of routinely provided by the state, does that kind of add a different spin to what domestic work means and how thoroughly it can be recognized by the receiving state? Martin, you want to go first?
Yeah, okay. Yeah. Thank you very much. I'll start with Jonathan's question. No, you're certainly right. I mean, I am suggesting that there's much more rationality in policy-making processes than most people would say and concede, but at the same time, you're obviously right. I mean, I work quite a lot with the British government, and I'm very aware that often policy is a fairly random outcome of the battle between the Home Office that wants to reduce immigration and the Business Department that wants to increase, especially student migration. And the restrictions we see in Britain at the moment are in large in response to public opinion that, for better or worse, has been very hostile to immigration for the last 35 years, actually. Now, on the fiscal impacts, I mean, most fiscal impact studies around the world find that the fiscal impacts of immigration are small. And that's because, but that's an average finding, that's because the guys at the top make quite a big positive contribution and lower wage workers tend to make a negative contribution. But what people often don't realize is that low wage citizens also make a negative contribution. So if you average this out, you get a small, but you're right, the studies that have looked at the fiscal impact of EU migration basically said it's small or positive, but that's because you're averaging it out. And in terms of labour market impacts, you're also right that, I mean, the best findings that we have suggest that the only kinds of immigrants who cause some displacements are non-EU workers during times of recession. Now, I would add that actually labour market impact analysis is incredibly difficult to do, and there's a big discrepancy in the UK between what the econometric studies tell us about the impact of European immigration, which is nothing, and what employers tell us. There's a big literature on employer recruitment of migrant workers, and I go around the country quite a lot talking to employers, and I rarely come across a low-wage employer who does not tell me that they have a clear preference for migrant workers. over British workers for all kinds of good or bad reasons, but they're more skilled, they're better workers, etc., etc. So there's this big discrepancy, which is in a way a bit unresolved, between the employer literature that says, you know, migrants are marvelous and British workers are useless, and the econometric literature doesn't find any labour market impact. So, so the point is not, and I think maybe I should articulate it better, the point of the paper is not so much to explain or justify, in a way, the British position, but just to kind of also speak to the European Commission to say, look, you've got different labour markets, different welfare states. These things do have implications for the scale and costs of immigration, and you might want to think about whether the insistence of this kind of exceptional position is really sustainable. And on the impact of the Commission on social policy, I mean, I'm not a huge expert on that. I mean, I know a little bit about migration, which is that and there have been quite a few court cases, I think, that have made a difference. What countries have tried to do is play around with what is legally possible within EU law. And there is actually quite a lot of leeway because, for example, in order to benefit from free movement, you have to be a worker. And what a worker is and how a worker is defined is a bit ambiguous. So, you know, if you work part-time, are you a worker? So some countries have tried to tighten up the definition of the worker, and the EU Commission has sometimes resisted that, and that is cut. I know in Denmark, the Danes are very unhappy with the recent court ruling that told Denmark that it must continue to grant child benefits to A8 migrants immediately on arrival. I mean, that's a big issue in the UK as well. It's a somewhat perverse position that if you're an EU me, as an Austrian migrant, if I have children in Austria and if I go to the UK, on day one I'm eligible for child benefits and I can send the money home for children that are not in the country. That, you know, so the Danes have been very unhappy with that. So I think the Commission has had an impact on that. I'll just end maybe with one thing. The peculiar situation of free movement is that I, as an Austrian in the UK, do now have some more rights than British citizens. Because in order to reduce immigration, the British government has implemented policy that has restricted the rights of citizens. For example, they clamp down on family immigration. So from now on, if you want to bring in a spouse or a partner from a non-EU country, you have to have an annual income of at least £19,000, which is just below the median wage. So half of all British citizens at the moment cannot bring in non-EU spouses because they don't earn enough. But because I'm an EU citizen, I don't have any income requirement. I can bring in anyone I like. So some of the perverse consequences has been that actually, in an effort to clamp down on immigration, the British government has taken away rights from citizens, but they can't touch my rights because I'm a EU national. And that kind of situation causes a lot of, and so that explains these borders, right? What's going on? You know, why does this guy have more rights than I?
Yeah. In the U.S., you actually have to have a minimum income requirement to be able to bring in a spouse. So there are a lot of people who also can't.
Where it's set,
and so thank you for your questions. Other categories, that was actually like a longer chart that I had to cut to fit the page. And so two that I want to point out in response to the question of what are other ways we could think about the labor conditions. And one key thing is the day off. Right, and so the right to a day off, and so not all the countries give a right to a day off, and so that's where you can really see the difference between countries that recognize the human rights of migrant domestic workers or just people in general and those who don't. And so places like Hong Kong, Malaysia, I think because of the British influence, give a day off. These Western countries like Denmark, Italy, Canada, the US, they tend to give a day off. And so the countries, so then Singapore is, because of the influence of the Convention 189, it's like the first country you see giving a day, that's a quote, not seen as a human rights country, give a day off. And that's about a year and a half old, that policy. But then a lot of domestic workers still only get a day off once a month in Singapore. And so in a lot of these other countries, like in the GCC in particular, they don't get a day off. But what's so interesting about the GCC is that while they don't get a day off, they don't necessarily not get a rest day. However, they cannot get a rest day independently of the family. And because in GCC countries, the employer has a moral obligation, like, to the domestic worker, and so then they don't want the domestic worker running around and getting like impregnated, particularly by Pakistani workers. And so for that reason, they like keep them isolated. And so, so it's not just, oh, I want to imprison these women, but there's actually this like moral motivation behind the employer's actions. And so another factor then that we can, that shows us differences in labor conditions is that post-national citizenship difference. And post-national citizenship is a idea by Yasmin Soysal that talks about the recognition of rights for undocumented workers. And so in all of these countries, like you cannot, except for Italy, they're all live-in workers, and so they're all like kind of stuck there. And so then the countries where there are more rights for undocumented workers, you see some opting to become, like live-out workers because they're undocumented, so they're not really bound to any citizen sponsor anymore. So a lot of these countries are interesting, like Denmark is interesting because then, these countries, I basically like define them as either having low, medium, or high post-national citizenship rights. And so United Arab Emirates is high. And so when I say high, I mean it's because there's a robust underground economy that they can go into. But then more importantly, or as importantly, they have access to healthcare. And so that they can go to private like health clinics or free clinics to, if they're sick. So Denmark I label as medium because Denmark basically, because of all these state benefits, there is no private care available. So if you're an undocumented worker and you get sick and you go to the hospital, you automatically get reported and you automatically not just get deported, but you're fined like a daily rate that you were undocumented, you basically have to pay for every day you're there. So you're almost kind of imprisoned within that country if you become undocumented. And so the countries that are low are basically like Singapore because there's no rights to, like there's no robust underground economy, but then also there's like no health care. And so then these countries then like Taiwan, the Gulf Cooperative Council countries, like you see domestic workers have more control and flexibility in the job because they can become like undocumented, and that's actually gives you greater freedom than if you were not undocumented. And so the question then about like, do countries then form coalitions to, fight for the conditions of workers, labor migrants in general? I think the answer really is no. Like you don't really see these like cross-national like allegiances between like consular offices. And so what's interesting about the Philippines is that they actually don't have labor centers in all of the countries. So there's no labor centers in the Philippine embassies or consulates in the U.S. because they don't really see Filipinos as workers here, but they see them as these like migrants in these professional jobs. And so you find these like labor offices in countries like the United Arab Emirates or Singapore, Japan, where there are like where they see more workers there. So what's interesting in like a lot of these countries that really have no rights for migrant workers. And so like I just want to focus on the GCC because the GCC, those are Gulf Cooperative Council countries, they don't have minimum wage rights. And so then labor and like wage standards are set by MOUs that are negotiated by countries. And so the country that's been most successful with these MOUs is the Philippines, which has basically tried to set up a $400 wage rate for their monthly wage rate for their domestics. What's interesting is that a lot of employers don't abide by it because then they go kind of with the standard set by Indonesians and Ethiopians, which are the two other large groups. And then they basically pay the domestics like, $220 a month. And so then they'll tell the Filipinos, well, I can get an Ethiopian for $220. And so then, but then what's really interesting when you talk to the Filipinos is that they use that minimum wage rate to negotiate with employers once they form kind of a bond with them. So at the end of their first contract, at the end of the 2 years, if the employer wants to renew them, then they'll say, well, you're not giving me the minimum wage. And so then the minimum wage becomes effective for them only after like 2 years of service where you get like only $200 a month. And so then Denmark is really interesting because then Denmark, while they have the creche system and while they have support that they give to elderly care workers, or the elderly, the recognition of just basically is domestic work is not really there as well. And so, because then they don't have a visa for domestic workers that basically recognizes them as laborers, but they only have this au pair program. And the au pair program, basically, a lot of locals see basically as this way that the government gets domestic workers in, while the government gets to not recognize this as actual labor. And so then, so who are these au pairs, right? You think these au pairs are there for a cultural exchange of sorts. So the largest number of au pairs in Denmark are Filipinos, and we know they're not there for a cultural exchange of any sort, right? And the second are the nearby Eastern European countries. And so then you see that it's really kind of a backdoor to domestic work, but then some argue that it's actually worse because because it's restricted to au pairs, they're really not considered as workers at all. Yeah.
Just really quickly, I just wanted to add a point of historical comparison on Martin's study. When we think about the moment in which these post-war development states were created, it's this period of massive population of people right after World War II, and refugees are on the move. And so these states are creating, the welfare state at the moment that they're dealing with refugees, and you also have refugees trying to get into Britain. So, there clearly is not quite the scale of now, and it's not people coming from the empire, but it is, refugee movement. You have, for example, people on the non-passport because they don't have state citizenship, and so that would be people who are on the move but have lost national status. And then for Estelle, I was just wondering, this is slightly, in a different direction, but how you might think about these kind of extraterritorial sites where contract workers are being brought in to do labor on American military bases, and so the contracting of women from Fiji, from Indonesia, or the Philippines, where they're being brought onto various military bases like in Afghanistan, Iraq, other places to do work like haircutting, cleaning, that kind of labor. Sort of where do you situate that? Because it also, the U.S. government tries to say, well, there can't be contracting, they can't pay, a contractor a fee to come here. But of course, this is actually what's happening. And so they get there, and the U.S. government says, you didn't pay a fee to get this job, did you? And so of course they say, no, but they did.
Yeah.
And they're not going to end up spending, the first year trying to pay it off, which means they're not actually getting work. It is indentured servitude. So I'm just wondering where that might fit into the issue.
Yeah.
So I'm going to ask you guys to respond really, really quickly because we're now running into our lunch break.
Okay.
And we also have an announcement. So why don't you guys respond to this question and then we'll wrap things up, okay?
So just quickly, I think that going into these bases is part of this long continuum of temporary migrant workers and the lack of rights they have, and that for the most part, most migrant domestic workers or migrant workers in general are without question indentured. But then while they're indentured, they really like to stay away from this word trafficking because then they're willing participants in this indenture is what's kind of interesting about their situation. So interestingly, in Dubai, I've interviewed quite a few former workers in Iraq. And what's interesting is they actually romanticized Iraq. I mean, they saw Iraq very positively because they felt safe in these bases, is the first thing. Their wages were higher because it was influenced a little bit by the American wage standards. And so then I think it's this component of the human rights recognition that they feel that they get in these liminal spaces of the bases, which is they kind of saw as better than their current situation in the United Arab Emirates, where they just had much more restrictive labor standards.
Yeah, just briefly, I think you're right. I mean, the kind of tension that I identify, I think, probably applies most strongly to a situation where it is quite clear that certain rights create net costs, and where it's accepted that immigration policy is strongly related to economic interests. So the point I make is that with refugees, of course, it is much harder to, well, you could be cynical and say we run our refugee policies based on costs and benefits, but of course there's a much harder moral humanitarian starting point imperative. In a way, you know, regardless of the costs, you've got to admit people. But that's not the case with labor immigration. I mean, there's no moral, most countries do not see a moral starting point, even though you could say normatively there should be, but there's no moral starting point, you should admit people. So you tend to admit people based on considerations about, you know, costs and benefits. So I think that's where the tension. But just very briefly, I think just related to your talk, I mean, the trade-off also operates in sending countries, especially countries sending workers to the Gulf states. So that these sending countries have two objectives: send more workers out and protect rights. And when push comes to shove, sending workers out is always more important than protecting rights. And the best example is, most of you will have heard about the Guardian newspaper has exposed the kind of a migrant death in Qatar, building those World Cup stadia. Nepalese workers. So Nepalese workers dying, and this is terrible and all of that. So what happened? The Nepalese government and the Qatari government gave a joint press conference where Nepal said there's no problem. Nepal said, well, this is all exaggerated. So why do they say that? Well, because they're under intense competition. They're concerned that if they become too insistent about the rights of their migrant workers, they'll be the next country who will say, oh, we'll send migrants. And so as soon as Indonesia becomes too vocal about its rights of domestic workers, Bangladesh steps in and says, well, we send them. And Saudi Arabia says, okay. So I think that's the problem, and that's where the collective organizing comes in. Unless these countries manage to have a collective position vis-à-vis these countries, there'll always be one country that will undercut by sending workers in, and that's the problem, I think.
Well, thanks. That was really depressing.
Sorry.